June 4th, 1942. The sun had barely crept above the horizon when Commander Mitsuo Fukita opened his eyes aboard the carrier Akagi, unaware that this morning would shatter an empire's dreams. For 6 months, Japan had written its narrative in victories Pearl Harbor, Singapore, the Philippines, each triumph feeding a dangerous conviction that the Imperial Japanese Navy was untouchable, that destiny itself had blessed their expansion across the Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, positioned 300 miles behind his carrier strike force. He had orchestrated this massive operation against Midway Atoll with meticulous detail, yet a gnawing unease troubled him. Unlike his subordinates who spoke of inevitable victory, Yamamoto harbored private doubts. He had studied at Harvard, traveled America's industrial heartland, and understood what his colleagues refused to acknowledge: Japan had awakened a sleeping giant. But even he could not have imagined how completely the next 24 hours would validate his fears. The Japanese plan reflected a fatal overconfidence. Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagumo commanded 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hirotha, same vessels that had devastated Pearl Harbor. His force would pummel Midway's defenses while simultaneously luring the American fleet into a trap. Japanese intelligence insisted that American carriers were nowhere near the battle zone. The assessment was catastrophically wrong. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, lurked northeast of Midway, their presence unknown to Nagumo's staff. This intelligence failure stemmed from institutional arrogance. Japanese naval officers had convinced themselves of American inferiority. They dismissed warnings, ignored contradictory evidence, and structured their planning around assumptions rather than facts, according to military historians at the Naval War College. This pattern of victory disease had infected Japanese strategic thinking throughout early 1942, creating an echo chamber where dissenting voices were silenced and uncomfortable truths were buried beneath layers of wishful thinking. Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tominaga led the first strike against Midway at 4:30 that morning. His planes bombed the atoll's installations, but the attack achieved limited results.
More critically,
Tominaga radioed back a message that would set disaster in motion. There is need for a second attack. Nagumo faced a dilemma. His aircraft were armed with torpedoes for anti-ship operations, anticipating the American fleet's arrival. Switching to land attack bombs would require at least an hour. But where were the American carriers? At 7:18, reconnaissance scout plane pilot Petty Officer First Class Amari transmitted the words that shattered Japanese assumptions. Have sighted what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships. Nagumo's blood ran cold. Minutes later, another message arrived. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. The intelligence community's reassurances evaporated. The Americans weren't distant, they were here, positioned perfectly to strike. Chaos erupted aboard Akagi. Nagumo ordered ordnance crews to rearm aircraft yet again, this time switching back to torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for naval targets. The flight decks became jumbled nightmares of exposed ordnance, fuel lines, and frantic personnel. Japanese procedures, so elegant on paper, collapsed under the pressure of rapid improvisation. The carriers were transformed into floating bombs. Their vulnerability compounded by the leadership's stubborn refusal to believe American capabilities matched their own. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded Task Force 16 from the carrier Enterprise, his calculated demeanor masking fierce determination. Unlike the Japanese, who had assumed American weakness, Spruance operated from a foundation of brutal realism. He knew his forces were outnumbered. He understood that Japanese aviators possessed superior experience. But he also held an advantage his opponents had dismissed. Station Hypo's codebreakers had penetrated Japanese naval communications, providing Spruance with something his enemies lacked: accurate intelligence. Commander Joseph Rochefort led the cryptanalysis team that had cracked Japanese naval code JUN-25. Working from a basement facility at Pearl Harbor, Rochefort's team had identified AF as the Japanese target designation for Midway. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, had gambled everything on Rochefort's assessment. Rather than dispersing his limited carrier strength, Nimitz concentrated his forces at the point where intelligence predicted the Japanese would strike. It was a calculated risk that reflected American pragmatism, willingness to trust evidence over assumptions. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron addressed his torpedo squadron aboard Hornet before dawn on June 4th. Waldron had disagreed vehemently with his air group commander about the proper search vector for locating the Japanese fleet. His instincts told him the enemy lay in a different direction than officially planned. Against orders, Waldron would lead his 15 torpedo bombers exactly where those instincts directed, straight toward Nagumo's carriers. Every man in Torpedo Squadron 8 would pay the ultimate price for Waldron's intuition, but their sacrifice would create the opening that changed history. The American strike launched in disorder that contrasted sharply with Japanese precision. Different squadrons departed at different times, failed to coordinate properly, and became separated during the flight to target. This apparent chaos, however, proved unexpectedly advantageous. Instead of arriving in one concentrated wave that Japanese defenses could systematically destroy, American aircraft approached in scattered groups throughout the morning, denying Nagumo's forces any respite. At 9:20, Waldron's torpedo bombers arrived over the Japanese fleet, flying low and slow. Ideal targets for enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire, Zero fighters swarmed the American planes like hornets. One by one, the torpedo bombers were shot down. Waldron's aircraft plunged burning into the Pacific, then another and another. Within minutes, 14 of 15 Devastators had been destroyed, their torpedoes failing to score a single hit. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the ocean amid the wreckage, watching the battle unfold from the water. More torpedo squadrons followed from Enterprise, from Yorktown. They met similar fates. The ocean became littered with burning aircraft and floating debris. Japanese officers congratulated themselves as American attack after attack was annihilated. Their Zero fighters had performed magnificently. The anti-aircraft gunners had maintained disciplined fire, and not one torpedo had struck home. Victory seemed confirmed. The Americans were brave, but outmatched, exactly as Japanese doctrine had predicted. But the torpedo attacks, though tactically disastrous, accomplished something crucial. They drew Japanese combat air patrol down to wave-top level, leaving the high altitude temporarily undefended. The attacks also pulled Japanese carriers into evasive maneuvering, breaking their formation and forcing them to turn constantly. Most critically, the relentless pressure prevented Nagumo from launching his own strike. His flight decks remained cluttered with aircraft being rearmed and refueled, each minute of delay increasing vulnerability. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey circled Enterprise's dive bombers at 14,000 feet, desperately searching empty ocean. His fuel gauges dipped toward critical levels. The Japanese carriers were supposed to be at these coordinates, but the Pacific stretched endlessly in every direction, empty and mocking. McCluskey faced a commander's nightmare: return to Enterprise with mission unfulfilled, or continue searching until his aircraft ran dry and ditched in the sea. At 10:12, McCluskey spotted a white wake scratching across the blue water below, the Japanese destroyer Arashi, racing at maximum speed to rejoin the fleet after conducting anti-submarine operations. McCluskey made an intuitive leap. That destroyer was heading toward something important. He adjusted his course to follow the Arashi's wake. 6 minutes later, his radio crackled to life with the call every pilot was waiting for: enemy carriers sighted. For Japanese carriers materialized below like toys on a blue carpet. From McCluskey's altitude, the distinctive shapes were unmistakable. More remarkably, their flight decks were crowded with aircraft. The carriers were caught in their most vulnerable condition-armed aircraft, exposed fuel lines, no fighters at altitude to intercept diving attackers. It was a miracle of timing, the convergence of circumstances so unlikely that McCluskey himself could scarcely believe it. Japanese lookouts spotted the American dive bombers at 10-20-4. Aboard Akagi, an officer shouted the warning that every carrier commander dreaded: helldivers. Nagumo's ships began evasive turns, but 40,000-pound vessels cannot pivot like fighter planes. The carriers remained massive, exposed targets as McCluskey's squadron rolled into their dives, followed almost simultaneously by dive bombers from Yorktown that had arrived independently moments earlier. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led Yorktown's bombers against the carrier Soryu. His squadron, flying dauntless dive bombers, plummeted through 3 miles of sky in near-vertical dives, reaching terminal velocity as they screamed toward their target. Japanese anti-aircraft fire intensified, black puffs of flak bracketing the American planes. But the bombers maintained their attacks with disciplined precision. 3 bombs struck Soryu within minutes. The first penetrated the flight deck and detonated amid aircraft being armed for launch. Secondary explosions ripped through the hangar bay as aviation fuel ignited. The second bomb penetrated deeper, exploding near the ship's ammunition magazines. The third hit transformed Soryu into an inferno. Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto ordered abandoned ship, but chose to remain aboard, going down with his vessel in accordance with traditional naval honor. Soryu would sink that evening, taking 718 men with her. McCluskey divided his squadrons between Akagi and Kaga. Lieutenant Dick Best led his section against Akagi. Nagumo's flagship, Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck just aft of the midship elevator, punching through the flight deck into the upper hangar. The detonation occurred amid aircraft loaded with fuel and torpedoes. The resulting explosion engulfed Akagi's hangar bay in flames that fed on aviation gasoline and ignited stored ordnance. Secondary explosions followed in rapid succession, each blast tearing deeper into the carrier's vitals. Captain Taijiro Aoki stood on Akagi's bridge as his flagship transformed into hell. Smoke poured from ruptured hatches, flames consumed the flight deck, and explosions rippled through the superstructure with rhythmic violence. The carrier that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack, the pride of the Imperial Navy, was dying beneath his feet. Damage control parties fought desperately to contain fires that fed on their own fuel, aviation gasoline spreading flames faster than men could extinguish them. Admiral Nagumo refused to abandon his post initially, but the bridge filled with acrid smoke, forcing the admiral's transfer to the light cruiser Nagara. Before departing Akagi, Nagumo witnessed the aircraft carrier Kaga suffering similar devastation. 4 bombs had struck Kaga, penetrating her flight deck and detonating amid fueled aircraft. The carrier's interior became a furnace, temperatures rising so intensely that metal deck plates glowed red and steel bulkheads warped. More than 800 of Kaga's crew would perish in the flames. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga had returned from the Midway strike to discover his carrier, Hiryu, the only Japanese flat top, to escape the initial American attack intact and operational. Despite having been wounded during the morning raid, despite his aircraft being damaged and low on fuel, Tominaga volunteered to lead the counterstrike against Yorktown. He understood that Japan's last carrier was their only remaining offensive capability. At 10:54, Tominaga led 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters toward the American task force, knowing he lacked sufficient fuel to return. Aboard Yorktown, radar operators detected the incoming Japanese strike. At 11:59, Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered his crew to action stations. Fighter aircraft scrambled to intercept while damage control teams positioned themselves throughout the vessel. Yorktown had already survived one critical battle. She had been damaged at Coral Sea in May and repaired in an impossible 72 hours at Pearl Harbor. Now she faced another test. Tominaga's bombers broke through the combat air patrol and pressed their attacks despite murderous anti-aircraft fire. The first penetrated deep into the ship before exploding, killing or wounding 66 men and extinguishing 5 of Yorktown's 9 boilers. The second bomb ignited fires on the hangar deck. The third bomb struck near the carrier's forward elevator, starting additional fires. Yorktown slowed to 6 knots, smoke pouring from her wounds, listing slightly to port. Yet Buckmaster's crew demonstrated the damage control excellence that Japanese leadership had consistently underestimated in American forces. Within 2 hours, engineering teams had restored power to 5 boilers. Damage control parties extinguished fires, restored ventilation, and patched holes. By 1400 hours, Yorktown was making 19 knots and recovering aircraft. Japanese pilots who had attacked her reported the carrier sunk, an assessment that reflected wishful thinking rather than reconnaissance discipline. Hiryu launched a second strike at 12:45, 10 torpedo bombers escorted by 6 fighters. These were the last offensive aircraft the Japanese possessed in the entire battle area. Lieutenant Tominaga had crashed during the first attack, his fuel-starved plane plunging into the ocean near Yorktown. Now Lieutenant Hashimoto Tushio led this final desperate gamble. At 14:30, his force located what they believed was an undamaged American carrier, actually Yorktown, now repaired sufficiently to appear operational. 4 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side in rapid succession, the underwater explosions more devastating than bombs. Seawater flooded through ruptured hull plates into engineering spaces, drowning machinery and drowning men. The carrier's list increased to 26 degrees. Power failed throughout the ship, plunging interior compartments into darkness. Buckmaster, recognizing that his vessel might capsize, gave the order to abandon ship at 3 o'clock. Nearly 2,700 men went over the side, rescued by escorting destroyers. Enterprise and Hornet launched strikes against Hiryu throughout the afternoon. At 1700 hours, dive bombers from Enterprise located the last Japanese carrier attempting to flee northwest. 4 bombs struck Hiryu in quick succession. The first bomb hit near the forward elevator, igniting fires that spread rapidly through the hangar bay. Additional hits transformed the carrier into a blazing wreck similar to her sister ships. Captain Tomio Kaku and Admiral Taman Yamaguchi chose to remain aboard, standing on the bridge as flames consumed their vessel. Hiryu sank the following morning. As darkness fell on June 4th, Admiral Yamamoto received reports from the battle zone that shattered his remaining hopes. 4 fleet carriers destroyed, hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft lost, thousands of trained aviators dead. The strategic situation had reversed completely in a single day. Yamamoto contemplated bringing his massive battleship force forward to engage the Americans in surface combat. But his staff officers convinced him that without air cover, the battleships would become targets for American carrier aircraft when dawn arrived. At 2:55 on the morning of June 5th, Yamamoto issued the order that confirmed Japan's first major naval defeat. Occupation of Midway is cancelled. The massive invasion fleet reversed course, retreating westward. Japanese forces would never again mount offensive operations of such scale and ambition. The initiative in the Pacific had passed permanently to the United States. Petty Officer, First Class Amari, whose scouting report had first alerted Nagumo to the American carrier's presence, survived the battle but not the war. He would die in combat operations months later, one among millions whose individual fates were consumed by the larger tragedy. His scouting report, delivered faithfully despite challenging conditions, represented exactly the kind of accurate intelligence that Japanese leadership consistently failed to act upon with sufficient urgency. Commander Mitsuo Fukita, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, was aboard Akagi during the battle. He survived the carrier's destruction but suffered injuries during evacuation. Recovering aboard the hospital ship Hikawa Maru, Fukita documented his observations of the battle. His later writings, according to historians at the U.S. Naval Institute, revealed the institutional failures that had enabled disaster: the rigid doctrine, the contempt for enemy capabilities, the suppression of dissenting analysis that might have predicted American strength at Midway. The Japanese Navy had entered the battle with 10 carriers in their operational inventory. But commitment failures and dispersed deployments meant only for participated in the crucial engagement. Meanwhile, American forces concentrated every available carrier precisely where intelligence indicated they were needed. This contrast, Japanese dispersal versus American concentration, reflected fundamentally different approaches to strategic risk. The Japanese sought to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously, dividing their strength. The Americans, operating from inferior numbers, concentrated force at the decisive point. Throughout the spring of 1942, Japanese naval intelligence had systematically misassessed American carrier strength and disposition. Commander Mino Rugenda, chief architect of the Pearl Harbor raid, had warned that American carriers represented the primary threat to Japanese operations. His counsel was noted, then largely ignored. Planning for Midway proceeded on the assumption that American carriers would arrive too late to influence events, if they appeared at all. This catastrophic intelligence failure emerged from cultural and institutional factors. Junior officers who identified potential problems faced professional risk if they challenged senior officers' assumptions. The Japanese military hierarchy demanded deference and discouraged dissent. As detailed in analyses by the Institute for Defense Analyses, this created an information environment where bad news traveled slowly upward, while optimistic assessments circulated freely, creating a distorted picture of reality that senior commanders mistook for truth. Admiral Matomu Gaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, maintained a detailed war diary throughout the conflict. His entries from the days preceding Midway revealed the cognitive dissonance plaguing Japanese leadership. Ugaki acknowledged theoretical possibilities of American carriers being present, but dismissed the likelihood based not on intelligence but on preference, because American presence would complicate Japanese plans. This pattern of believing what was convenient rather than what was probable characterized strategic thinking throughout the Japanese command structure, The failure extended beyond intelligence assessment to operational planning. Japanese battle plans for Midway were extraordinarily complex, involving multiple forces approaching from different directions with precise timing requirements. The plan assumed perfect execution and no enemy interference during critical phases. There were no contingencies for the unexpected, no flexibility built into the operational design. American military planners, by contrast, accepted that plans would fall apart under combat conditions and emphasized adaptable execution over rigid choreography. Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe commanded the submarine I-168. Positioned on the perimeter of the Midway operation area, his vessel detected American carriers moving toward Midway before the battle began. Tanabe attempted to report this crucial intelligence, but communication failures and command indifference prevented the information from reaching Nagumo in time to alter Japanese dispositions. The infrastructure for collecting intelligence existed, but the institutional culture for acting upon uncomfortable facts did not. Japanese naval aviation had developed around offensive doctrine that emphasized striking first and striking decisively. Defensive capabilities received less attention and training. Carrier air groups practiced relentless attack, but invested minimal effort in defending their own vessels. When American dive bombers appeared overhead on June 4th, the systemic neglect of defensive preparedness became lethally apparent. Japanese carriers lacked effective radar for air search and early warning. Their anti-aircraft armament was lighter than American equivalents, and their doctrine provided no practiced response to simultaneous attacks from multiple vectors. The American success at Midway emerged partly from accepting reality rather than denying it. Admiral Nimitz operated from the premise that Japanese forces were competent, numerous, and dangerous. This assumption drove him to concentrate every available resource at the threatened point. When intelligence suggested Midway was the target, Nimitz committed his limited carrier strength completely rather than hedging against uncertainty. The decision reflected confidence in intelligence analysis and willingness to accept risk based on factual assessment rather than wishful thinking. Captain Taman Yamaguchi commanded the 2nd Carrier Division aboard Hiryu. Regarded as one of Japan's most promising flag officers, Yamaguchi had advocated immediate counterattack when 3 carriers burned on June 4th. His aggressive instincts drove Hiryu's strikes against Yorktown. But when his own carrier succumbed to American bombs, Yamaguchi made the traditional choice. He remained aboard as flames consumed Hiryu, choosing death over survival. Japan lost not merely a carrier, but a talented commander whose future contributions died with him in the Pacific depths. The Japanese military culture that produced Yamaguchi's final decision, honorable death over retreat, also contributed to their defeat at Midway. The emphasis on spiritual strength over material factors, on will over technology, on face over flexibility, created strategic blindness. When confronted with evidence that challenged established doctrine, Japanese leadership defaulted to doubling down on existing approaches rather than adapting. This cultural rigidity, according to research compiled by scholars at the MacArthur Memorial, prevented the institutional learning that might have corrected mistakes before they became catastrophic. Lieutenant Richard Best, whose bomb had fatally wounded Akagi, returned to Enterprise with his dive bomber badly damaged and fuel tanks nearly empty. Best had breathed caustic soda lime fumes from his aircraft's defective oxygen system during the attack, damaging his lungs. Though he survived the battle, Best was medically grounded and spent months in hospitals. His war was effectively over after one perfect bomb. Unlike the Japanese, who lost entire air groups and possessed limited capacity to train replacements, American training infrastructure churned out new pilots continuously, ensuring that individual losses, however tragic, did not cripple operational capability. The contrasting industrial capacities between the combatants rendered the Midway defeat exponentially more damaging for Japan than equivalent losses would have been for America. Japanese shipyards required years to construct fleet carriers, while American yards, benefiting from massive industrial investment, would eventually produce carriers in months. The 4 carriers Japan lost at Midway represented a strategic investment that could not be rapidly replaced. America lost Yorktown, but had Enterprise and Hornet still operational, with new Essex-class carriers already under construction. Commander Joseph Rochefort, whose cryptanalysis had enabled American victory, received no official recognition immediately following the battle. Bureaucratic rivals in Washington questioned his methods and findings. Rochefort was eventually reassigned away from intelligence work, As a victim of institutional politics that prioritized procedural orthodoxy over demonstrable results. This petty bureaucratic maneuvering illustrated that even victorious organizations struggle with internal dysfunction, though American military culture ultimately proved more capable of correcting mistakes than its Japanese counterpart. Ensign George Gay floated in the Pacific for 30 hours after his torpedo bomber was shot down. The sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8 from his position in the water. Gay witnessed the entire battle unfolds, Japanese carriers burning, American dive bombers attacking, the vast choreography of destruction occurring above and around him. Rescued by a PBY Catalina flying boat, Gay provided valuable after-action intelligence. His survival and subsequent debriefing demonstrated American commitment to learning from combat experience, even from tactical failures like the torpedo attacks. The Japanese retreat from Midway initiated a strategic reassessment that leadership was ill-equipped to conduct honestly. Rather than acknowledging fundamental errors in intelligence, planning, and doctrine, official reports emphasized bad luck and enemy numerical superiority. The comfortable lies spread through the command structure, insulating decision-makers from accountability while preventing institutional reform, American after-action reports. Conversely, documented failures brutally and specifically, the poor torpedo performance, the coordination failures, the heavy bomber loss, creating a foundation for tactical improvement. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters faced the nearly impossible task of explaining catastrophic defeat to a population conditioned to expect continuous victory. Initial reports to the Japanese public drastically understated losses, claiming minor setbacks rather than acknowledging the strategic disaster. Surviving personnel from the sunken carriers were quarantined upon return to Japan, forbidden to discuss what they had witnessed. This institutional dishonesty prevented learning from failure and ensured that the same patterns of self-deception would recur throughout the war. Admiral Yamamoto maintained his position as combined fleet commander, but understood that his strategic gambit had failed disastrously. The man who had orchestrated Pearl Harbor and warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year had watched his prediction come horrifyingly true. After Midway, Japan would fight defensively, yielding initiative to an opponent whose industrial and manpower advantages would manifest increasingly over time. Yamamoto would die in April 1943 when American fighters, again guided by intercepted communications, ambushed his aircraft over Bougainville. Yorktown refused to die quickly. Despite Captain Buckmaster's abandonment order on June 4th, the carrier remained afloat, listing but stable. On June 5th, salvage parties reboarded the vessel and began recovery operations. For 2 days, teams worked to save the damaged carrier, making surprising progress. But Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Tanabe, located the wounded carrier on June 6th. Tanabe's torpedoes struck Yorktown and the destroyer Haman, which was providing power to the carrier. Both vessels sank, Yorktown finally succumbing on June 7th, 3 days after the battle. The delay between abandonment and sinking illustrated another. American advantage damage control doctrine and training far superior to Japanese equivalents. Yorktown absorbed punishment that would have sunk her Japanese counterparts more quickly. American carriers featured better compartmentalization, superior firefighting systems, and crews drilled extensively in damage control procedures. This defensive resilience reflected a military culture that planned for things going wrong rather than assuming perfect execution. Commander John Waldron's leadership of Torpedo Squadron 8 into certain destruction sparked debate about the ethics of suicidal tactics. Unlike Japanese forces, which institutionalized deliberate self-sacrifice through kamikaze doctrine later in the war, American military culture viewed such attacks as tragic necessities rather than ideal solutions. Waldron's determination to engage the enemy, despite overwhelming odds, reflected individual courage rather than systemic expectation of death. The distinction mattered. American forces mourned their losses and sought to prevent recurrence, while Japanese doctrine increasingly embraced death as strategic methodology. The battle's tactical lessons were absorbed unevenly. American forces recognized that torpedo bombers flying low and slow were excessively vulnerable to fighter interception. Future carrier air groups would emphasize dive bombers and develop more effective fighter-bomber aircraft. The vulnerability of carriers to bomb and torpedo damage was confirmed, driving innovations in damage control and defensive armament. Japanese forces, hampered by institutional dishonesty about what had occurred at Midway, implemented fewer meaningful reforms. At Guadalcanal, fighting began 2 months after Midway when American forces landed on August 7, 1942. The campaign demonstrated how completely the strategic balance had shifted. Japan, now fighting defensively and unable to replace losses at American rates, struggled desperately to hold positions they had seized effortlessly months earlier. The industrial and demographic advantages that Yamamoto had feared manifested exactly as he had predicted. Historians examining Midway through subsequent decades identified the battle as the decisive turning point in the Pacific War, though fighting would continue for 3 more years. The significance lay not merely in tactical outcomes for Japanese carriers destroyed versus won, American, but in demonstrating that Japanese leadership's fundamental assumptions about the conflict were fantastically wrong. American forces were not qualitatively inferior. American resolve did not crumble after initial setbacks. American industrial capacity could not be overcome by spiritual determination alone. The cultural factors that produced Japan's defeat at Midway: rigid hierarchy, suppression of dissent, preference for comforting lies over uncomfortable truths, persisted throughout the war. In August 1945, even after 2 atomic bombs had destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japanese leadership struggled to accept surrender, with some military officers attempting a coup to prevent the emperor's surrender broadcast. The pattern of denying reality until forced by catastrophe to acknowledge it characterized Japanese strategic decision-making from Midway through Hiroshima. Commander Mitsuo, Fuchida's post-war writings, particularly his collaboration with American historians on the volume Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan, provided crucial Japanese perspectives on the battle. Fuchida acknowledged the institutional failures that had enabled disaster, though some historians noted his tendency to minimize his own role in perpetuating optimistic assessments before the battle. The complex truth was that even perceptive officers like Fuchida had participated in the collective delusion that led to Midway. Admiral Raymond Spruance received command of the Fifth Fleet and continued demonstrating the calculated aggression that had characterized his Midway performance. His career illustrated how American military culture rewarded merit and results rather than seniority alone. Spruance had been junior to his carrier task force colleague Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, but his performance earned him increasing responsibility. Japanese military hierarchy, bound by rigid seniority systems, lacked equivalent flexibility in identifying and promoting talent. The technological innovations that emerged from Midway's lessons transformed naval warfare. American carriers increasingly emphasized radar for early warning, improved damage control systems, and enhanced anti-aircraft armaments. Elite tactics evolved to assume multi-carrier operations with sophisticated fighter direction and coordinated strikes. Japanese forces, starting from a position of greater desperation and limited resources, struggled to implement equivalent improvements. The gap in capabilities widened rather than narrowed as the war progressed. In June 1947, exactly 5 years after the battle, Admiral Chester Nimitz published his official assessment of Midway's significance. Nimitz credited the victory to intelligence, to junior officers' initiative, to courage under fire, but also to fortune, the luck of timing that placed American dive bombers over Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment. Nimitz understood that war involves chance as well as planning, a truth that Japanese leadership had failed to adequately incorporate into their strategic thinking. The wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu rest on the Pacific floor, at depths exceeding 17,000 feet. Modern expeditions using deep-sea submersibles have documented the broken carriers, each one a monument to leadership's catastrophic failure to align strategy with reality. The ships lie scattered across miles of ocean floor, exactly as they sank Akagi with her distinctive forward flight deck, Kaga's massive hull broken and twisted, Soryu's wreckage scattered by the violence of her end. When historians assess the Pacific War's turning points, Midway occupies the central position, not because it ended. Japanese offensive capability, immediately significant operations continued for months, but because it demonstrated with brutal clarity that Japan's strategic assumptions were illusions. The supposed American weakness was myth. Promised quick victory was fantasy. The inevitable triumph that propaganda had proclaimed was impossible. Reality had been avoided for months, dismissed in favor of comforting narratives. At Midway, reality arrived with 1,000-pound bombs that penetrated flight decks and shattered more than steels. They destroyed the delusions that had guided an empire toward catastrophe. The reckoning that Yamamoto had privately feared came not in years, but in minutes. 5 immortal minutes when American dive bombers rolled into their dives and forever altered history's trajectory. Japanese leadership had avoided reality, and at Midway, reality stopped permitting avoidance.